everyone, and welcome to Cosmologies. I'm your host, Natalie, and in this Cosmologies interview, we're going a little deeper into our Jupiter-Saturn conjunction with special guest Doc McDowell. Doc is a professional astrologer and tarot reader in the Northwest, a lecturer at pagan events on the West Coast, and is trained in archetypal astrology and herbalism. Y'all, I had so much fun with Doc as our very first guest. He was such a great sport and is such a wealth of knowledge. In the interview ahead, we will delve into planetary archetypes, notable conjunctions in history, and all kinds of other juicy astrology tidbits. As a final note before we hop in, I want to remind viewers that neither I nor any of my guests can claim to have all of the answers. We are all students with vastly different lived experiences and courses of study, and we are all in very different places on our journeys. And with that little disclaimer out of the way, welcome to Cosmologies. Let's get started.
All right, well, good evening and welcome, Doc, to Cosmologies. I'm wondering if you can start us off here by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into astrology.
Sure. So I am a local Pacific Northwest astrologer. I give lectures on astrology and tarot. I'm still kind of new at this. Um, I've gone through the Rocky Mountain School of Astrology, kind of a West Coast school of a mixture of kind of inner cosmos astrology as well as more of the traditional mundane and horary work. But these days I tend to drift personally over into inner cosmos or archetypal astrology, and that's my main focus.
Fantastic. I'm wondering also if you can add a little bit more about where astrology fits into your personal worldview.
Sure. So I strongly believe that astrology is in many ways the story of us. It is the archetypes that move through us in the Western consciousness, that they are our inner cosmos in relation to the outer cosmos. Um, I think it's important to study today because we've been given uh, much of our science and our understanding today has a lot of what we need to do to understand the world from an atomistic level. But what astrology does is kind of return us to a mythic level. It says these are things that we cannot necessarily prove with science, but they are part of the inner meaning that we crave and that we need from deeper senses of the cosmos, sort of similar and adjacent to religion, but it's more of an inner discovery of these things that I feel gives me and many of the people I work with meaning. So I've dedicated my life to that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think in the intro video here that I've gone into about our introduction to astrology, I've kind of mentioned that, astronomy and astrology, a lot of these sciences used to be really tight, and where astronomy became like an empirical study, astrology is more of like a catch-all for everything else. And there's a lot of everything else's out there.
Exactly. One of my one of my favorite authors, and the famous uh, Rich Tarnas, has a beautiful quote in his book Cosmos and Psyche, where he says that he takes Max Weber's famous term of the disenchanted, or the world being disenchanted, or Unstabilit, and Weber saw it as quite important as being since people move away from religion and only see science as the course of all answers, we wouldn't be able to see both as a potential source of answers rather than just one or the other. So he was very concerned with that idea, and in many ways, I think astrology is one of those things to kind of help bridge that gap of that problem that was cited over 100 years ago.
Fantastic. Well, as you know, we are doing today's episode on the grand conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn coming up here. So I know that we're going to be talking a little bit about some archetypal astrology in particular, But before we go any further, I'm wondering if you can clear up a little bit for us what, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different types of astrology out there. But if you can do one clarification for us on the difference between archetypal and horary astrology.
Yeah, sure. So archetypal astrology simply means the interest of what the planets mean in us. So, for example, Mars being kind of like our drive, our natural drive, our sometimes our aggressions, it's called, our animal selves. Those archetypes being associated with that planet, you would say in archetypal astrology that that planet, those these behaviors or these attributes of a particular person's behavior or things going on in their life may be associated with Mars if we take those subjective terms, and Jupiter henceforth as well with things like being good with money or being beneficent or generous, that kind of thing. Horary is about the somewhat more ancient and interesting science of astrology about events, about time, since the word horary comes from, of course, our Latin words going back to time, that we get hours from, for example, where it's about specific timed events in astrology that we as astrologers have been relied upon to give answers for certain events that are upcoming or the study of past events.
Yeah, fantastic. I love how many of our words for time come from studies of the stars.
Absolutely.
Moon month. Almost all of our days are based off of gods in turn.
Right, right. We had to have religion remind us about what the hours were in Catholic tradition, for example, with like Vespers and Compline and all of that.
Yeah. Well, let me take this. I think that was a fantastic explanation. Thank you for clearing that up there. Um, we are going to be talking again about this Jupiter and Saturn conjunction, which at its very, scientific level, at its very basic level, is about two planets in the sky kind of crossing each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our other video with the planetarium stuff. But we're hoping to talk to you for a little bit more insight about what that could mean. So to start us off here, you've mentioned Jupiter as being kind of beneficent or good with money or such. I'm wondering if you can expand for us on the energy of Jupiter.
Certainly. Uh, so for Jupiter, Jupiter's kind of an interesting planet because it's our largest planet in the solar system. Um, it was visible by the ancients, so it's in that classical range of planets that we refer to as being the second to last planet before Saturn. So even the ancients knew that it had a particular significance. It was rather large. It seemed to at times almost be larger than Mars, even though it's quite a bit more distant to Jupiter than it is from Earth to Mars. But they they attribute it to uh, was attributed to Jupiter just for the fact that it was there and just so large in the sky, and also some of its astrological where it was placed where it was placed within the elliptical belt. So, relating to what we see in Jupiter, um, I mean, we see it being the themes of fortune and divine righteousness is something that comes up a lot in the ancient literature. So we have that association with Zeus, where we get for the Romans got uh, Zeus's name to be Jupiter. So they still associate a lot of that same stuff that the Greeks did with this particular deity and applied it to the planet. So we get the idea of expansion, theories of everything, the ways in which we understand the infinite with our finite minds. So Jupiter really represents those sorts of feelings and archetypes in us that are about that kind of expansion.
Fantastic. And the same for Saturn.
Saturn, yeah. So Saturn being the next and last of the classical planets, it's important to note that the ancients only saw our visible planets as being the edge of the solar system in the past, because it explains a lot of the symbolism of what they associated with Saturn. So Saturn was seen as the last planet to them. In that sense, it was associated with limitation, It was associated with record keeping, timekeeping. It had to do with the limitations that we might place upon ourselves in both abstract and as well as in physical terms. So Saturn was often relied upon in ancient hymns for like the openings of certain temples because he was seen as being associated with um, structures, the new building of frames to certain types of structures. He was just seen as being the energy associated with that particular kind of orderliness. So that's where a lot of Saturn's energy lies.
And yeah, so it's like I'm hearing from you that it's a structural energy. Is there anything to be said for it being kind of like a deep kind of timeless energy, or is that more the Jupiter side of things?
Well, they can both be pretty timeless, but
Mhm.
Saturn is definitely about the limitations upon that time, whereas Jupiter is kind of just as sort of like well, we'll get it done eventually. We'll just keep going, expansion, 7% growth every year, whatever. But Jupiter is not like Saturn in the sense that Saturn wants to know what's going to happen. It is about knowing where those limitations are going to be. It doesn't like to leave things up to chance. It likes to always know that there's a strict orderliness to it.
Right. Okay. So we've spoken previously before about kind of our outer planets and where they factor into astrology, and they're not necessarily important to this particular discussion, but I think it might be fun to just touch on before we move forward about why Jupiter and Saturn are kind of the edge of our astrological universe up until a certain point where we start to incorporate some new planets. And of course, we have our next two planets, Uranus and Neptune, are not discovered until quite a while later. Just quick side branch, if we could just go into really quickly, if these are the ends of of our solar system, Saturn and Jupiter, what we start ascribing to things that are even further out, such as Uranus and Neptune.
Hmm. Yeah, we can talk a little bit about that. So, I mean, as we
Not
know,
too deep.
no, not too deep. So, so, so as we know, as you know, as in having more to do with astronomy, I mean, we get William Herschel in 1781 discovers that there's actually something beyond Saturn, and it doesn't appear to just be a fixed star. It appears to be a planet in our solar system. He discovers that there's 1781. This planet is kind of out there. Um, Decides that it has to be there. Goes to the Royal Society of England and says, "Hey, this is a planet." There's a lot of skepticism because at that time it was still believed that the heavens ended with that, and the fixed stars were all part of the starry firmament that had a lot of biblical references that people didn't want to really think about at the time. So,
Right, it's like the 1600s.
right, and Herschel being at that edge of the Enlightenment, the Royal Society of London and other scientific bodies were more willing to consider things that they might not have a century or 2 centuries previous. So in comes Uranus, and William Herschel wanted to name Uranus originally after King George III. I found out it was kind of interesting. So it was going to be called
Yeah.
George originally, and eventually, we don't know who exactly was responsible for this. It could have been Herschel himself. It could have been one of his rival astronomers in France. We're not exactly sure. Who decided that Uranus would make the most sense following Saturn, the last known planet, and that of course begins our transuranic planets that go beyond that point. Um, Neptune not being discovered not too long after. It was like 1806. It was pretty.
I don't remember when Neptune was discovered, to be honest.
But yeah, um, I don't have the numbers or figures right on me, but it's pretty far, isn't it, between Saturn and Uranus in our solar system? It's
Yeah, yeah. We have our gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, and then even further out, we have Neptune and Uranus there. Supposedly, for a long time, we believed them to also just be gas giants, but now we believe that they're actually ice giants. That there's kind of like a rocky ice core on the inside of them, and they're just like way out there.
Yeah, that is so freaking cool to me.
Yeah, and they also have rings. We thought it was just Saturn, but they also have rings.
Right. That kind of threw me through a loop too. No pun intended. That there was like supposed to be, I mean, we have other rings on other planets. It makes sense considering that planets, even smaller planets in the edge of the solar system, will still have orbits. Orbit will still occur. But um, yeah, that was kind of interesting to me, knowing that 896 miles actually separates apparently Uranus with Saturn. So I mean, that's significant. I mean,
Is
you
that
look.
896 like thousand, hundreds of thousand, or millions, or?
There we go. 896 million miles.
There we go. That sounds a lot more like it.
There we go. I was missing a pretty big set of zeros there.
Like, actually, those things sound really close. Like, I could drive there.
Possibly. That's actually drivable. Some modes of old Soviet car could probably make it, but yeah.
Yeah, real long way.
But our focus in the next few weeks is going to be on those two planets, Saturn and Jupiter.
Yes. Yes, fantastic. So, speaking about them being far out, we have these really large orbits, and the longer it takes for something to orbit around the sun, well, the further something out, the longer it takes to orbit, is what I mean to say there. So, can you tell us a little bit about why this grand conjunction is so cool and so rare?
Yeah. So astronomically, we get Saturn Jupiter conjunctions. If you want me, I can describe a little about what a conjunction is first. If you
Sure,
want.
yeah.
Yeah. So a conjunction is one of those rare terms where it's the same in both astronomy and astrology. It just means any celestial body that um, is within about 3 degrees of orb with each other. Sometimes you see them unlisted for 6 degrees of orb. Typically, in my own practice, I like to do it typically if they're within 3 degrees of conjunction, and this just means when they are uh, conjunction, that being within that degree, if people can't see what we're talking about, it's more like if you're looking at like degrees in the sky of the horizon, when something approaches it, it's right next to each other. So we would call that, if it was within 3 degrees of being perfectly overlapped, we would say that that is conjunct. So when a planet overlaps each other or a celestial body overlaps each other, we call that a conjunction. And in that sense, it's the same as astronomy as it is in astrology. So what that has to do coming up. Yeah, so Saturn Jupiter conjunctions are on 20-year cycles. Astronomically, they happen roughly every 20 years. There's a little bit of wobbliness there. Saturn's um, Saturn's orbit around the sun is 29 years, whereas Jupiter's is 12. So, I mean, that's a lot of distance that they can possibly cover. So the last one we had was in 2000, and a lot of folks who were alive that time remember there was a lot going on then too. And we as astrologers pay a lot of attention to what was happening at those events. Now, what's fascinating is astrologers are not as we're not as fascinated in that event as they are in this one.
Yeah. Well, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these are events that occur, but they really are setting up a new cycle, is kind of what's occurring, right? Because
Correct.
when I'm looking back on the specifically the spring of 2000, which was when the last one occurred, compared to 2020, it was kind of a slow news year. Other than there's this big election that's happening, and then it's hotly contested, and then that kind of, I feel like, sets in a whole new wave of things, because 9/11 happens the year after that, and a lot happens.
Right, right. And that's been our 2020 themes have been really focused around that. So I should I should hedge here that this is where we kind of get into that weird zone, liminal space of archetypal astrology meets horary astrology. I'm starting to kind of feel that there is a little bit more to horary than I used to, given the events of this year and the fact that there were astrologers that had predicted that it might be a little bit like this year based off of the planetary events. Um, so it's not like this was completely out of the blue. There were a few astrologers in the past who suggested that this time might might forebode some of the elements that associate themselves with Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius and conjuncting each other. If you want to go a little bit into that, like why
Yeah.
astrologers care
Well,
so much about it.
why don't we take a pause on the horary for just a minute to go back to the archetypal of what we can expect to possibly occur when Saturn and Jupiter are conjunct in general, and then also what it means when what it might mean when they're conjunct right now in, shall we say, Aquarius and or Capricorn.
Certainly.
And then we'll
Um,
back to horary because that's like a whole other can of worms.
no, that's okay. I guess my question is more so just more of like what's going to happen compared to that archetypally, those two things together.
Uh,
So let's see. I have right. So do you want me to start with Saturn or Jupiter first?
um, let's start with what happens because we talked about Saturn and Jupiter energy. Let's talk about what happens when they conjunct in general,
Yeah, sure.
disregarding house for now.
Yeah. We'll keep that to the side. So Saturn and Jupiter, when they come together, these two elements together between limitation and growth. So those two things seem rather contradictory until you consider the fact that um, they're right next to. I mean, they is how they look from Earth. They look like they're right next to each other. Obviously, we know they're pretty distant. They're tens of millions of miles apart. Um, and we we look at Jupiter conjunct Saturn, and that energy is about confronting our own inhibitions and self restrictions. So it's about restrictions we place upon ourselves and the circumstances related to that. It's it's really important when those two things come together, when those two energies come together. It's like we look at all the things that we've been reassessing as a population that's been restricting us, and then Jupiter comes along and says, you know what, it's we need to think bigger about this. We need to be more concerned about what's coming up ahead, opposed to what's been limiting us previously. So when these sorts of conjunctions happen, it's like you think they'd be an odd couple, Saturn and Jupiter, but when they meet like that, it's like both are willing to move forward. Jupiter loves Saturn because it says, "Hey, now I have something to build upon." It's like the kid you give us like a set of blocks to, and then the Jupiter is like, or Saturn upon Jupiter is like, "Oh, now I can escape the boundaries I put upon myself." So that's why astrologers have looked historically at these two things coming together as being very propitious.
Fantastic. So then talking about the house that this occurs in, depending on the type of astrology that you do, it's either going to be in Aquarius or in Capricorn. And we'll talk more in a later episode all about sidereal versus tropical astrology. But if you want to kind of give us a little bit of lay of the land there and your opinion on this, and what school you subscribe to, and just a couple of different interpretations of that, I'd love to set you loose on that.
Absolutely. So most astrologers in the West, we follow tropical, which means we use a tropical system of astrology, and this is opposed to sidereal, which we won't get into here. But we used we use it as we use it because since the time of Ptolemy, we have it's based off what was viewed in the sky at Earth's heliacal belt from the time of Ptolemy. So that means the precession of those 12 zodiacs or 13, depending on how you want to look at that, as they go around each other as viewed from Earth, which you can still more or less view the same as today with some variation. Um, But that heliacal belt that Ptolemy observed and his contemporaries observed is still more or less there. It's a little wobbly, but it's still there. But it is for folks wondering at home. It is based off of things which were once an observed science, and that's why astrologers, for the most part, still prefer the tropical system opposed to the sidereal, because it was Ptolemy's viewed observations of Earth from Earth.
And that's also what we've built so much mystique, zeitgeist, egregore around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So then when this happens in when this happens in Aquarius or when this happens in Capricorn, what are we going to expect?
Yeah, so this is a 200-year cycle. Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius doesn't happen but once every 200 years. This is the first time it's been within 0 degrees of orb, so we're talking about a conjunction that's down to minutes in an astronomical sense. Yeah, so it's going to be really, really close. It has not been this close since 1623. The last time we had in the 19th century, in the 1800s, I believe it was considered pretty far apart and wasn't really visible as well as it will be this year. That's important because having it be visible is part of kind of the omen factor that astrologers are applying upon this. Because remember, with archetypal astrology, it's about what people perceive about a thing as much as it is it being a thing.
Mm-hmm.
If people see it up in the sky, they'll think, "Oh, hey, this is some crazy interesting event that's about to happen." Um, Saturn Jupiter conjunctions are really bright and very visible from Earth when you see them like the way they're about to be this year. Um, the most famous one that um, is talked about most often in history is about the one that happened in what we believe to be the year 6 BCE, which was the one that associated many medieval astrologers associated with the birth of Christ, if Christ was born then. Um, Either way, we don't know if Christ was born at that time, but we do know that there was indeed a conjunction that would match up to that time around between 6 BCE and 8 BCE. So it was a pretty big deal. And after that, a lot of folklore believes that the Star of Bethlehem may have been people seeing that, which is definitely could be a plausible explanation, but um, people looking up at the sky at the time would have no idea that we were actually looking at two astral bodies conjoining, but they would look at that and say, "Hey, that's pretty ominous." So
Pretty weird looking star.
exactly.
I've heard a couple of different theories about the Star of Bethlehem, and this is, I mean, it's irrelevant. We got Christmas around the corner here. I've heard that it's possible it was a long period comet. I've also heard that maybe there was a supernova somewhere, and then this is another, like, one of the only things we've actually been able to say, like, yeah, that actually there was a thing happening there. But sometimes, I'll get students in the planetarium who, like, I'll be sent out to a Catholic school or something. They'll say, "Can you show us like the Jesus star?" And this is the closest thing I can actually say, well, yeah, look, there's this thing happening, but that's as far as we know, the only thing I can show them in the planetarium.
Right, right. I mean, you can show them pictures of what past conjunctions look like, and in the sky, I mean, they're pretty bright. It's like they're not always the brightest nighttime cosmic light source, but they are uh, they can be pretty visible. And the point is that they would be moving, and people in the ancient world would be looking at that more so than, "Hey, that's really bright." Planets, of course, we get the Greek word from the word for wanderer. They
Yeah,
wandered together. People would not at this time. Yes, understanding of science was limited in those days, but people knew enough to know that they weren't just looking at fixed stars. They knew they were looking at something that was moving together. That was just kind of, what is going on? So
for sure. And, even at that time, like specifically around the year 0 BC, we already had many astrology systems in place around the globe that had already determined, all right, these are planets, these are stars. There's stuff going on here.
absolutely. Did you want me to talk about other conjunctions since then? What they meant, or did you want me to talk about?
Maybe what this Aquarian or Capricornian energy would mean upon, this conjunction.
Right. So like we talked about a little bit beforehand, I already prefaced with the fact that Saturn is the maker, the materials themselves, the raw material as it is. Jupiter is like the expander of those materials. He's the foreman of the. No, he's the architect, and Saturn is the foreman. That's probably a better analogy. Because Jupiter is all about dreams, and Jupiter is about what is thought up, what we can do, what's possible, what let's try it even if it's not possible. I mean, that's the very definition of hope, right? Is you're willing to look forward even if you're not sure if it's possible or not.
Yeah.
Saturn is more about expectation, and that's where you get like the foreman of a project. The foreman won't care about the hope of it. They will be thinking about
Will it get done?
will it get done. About this conjunction, 2020, get the meat of it. So Saturn and Jupiter in conjunction will happen on the 21st this year, December. It's a big deal because it's in Aquarius. Aquarius is an air sign, despite the fact that it has a watery sounding name. A lot of people get confused. But anybody who is an Aquarius, who's looked up your horoscope online, probably is pretty well aware that it might be the water bearer, but it's considered as part of the air triplicities, which in astrology just means one of the three other air signs. In this case, Gemini and Libra join Aquarius here. With Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, that's going to be a big thing. It means that Saturn is going to be in the sign that it rules, and Jupiter will be. Jupiter isn't. It's not. It's not its exalted sign, but it's really happy there. It's very much. It wants to be in Pisces because that's where the sign it rules. But it's okay with Aquarius too. It's not like it's in serious detriment. Um, so that's where we get this air triplicity. Um, we're really excited about this as astrologers because with this air sign and one of the major conjunction planets has an exalt. I mean, has its exaltation. We're really excited about it because that means that there may be more of this manifesting in our lives than might otherwise in other events, say like the one in 2020 or sorry, say the one in 2000 or the ones that happened in the 20th century, similar conjunctions.
Right. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, um, can we also talk a little bit about these degrees? So we're going to talk a little bit about this in the other video and how the degrees and minutes means like how close these planets are going to pass by each other. But when these things pass by as closely as they do, you had some juicy facts and figures about some of the last times that they've passed by this close to each other, because this is going to be, I think, the closest in nearly 400 years or so.
That's correct. Closest since the 1620s. So the value of this event, we know about it. What astrologers do is we monitor what happened in events previously to get an idea as to what to expect. So some of the facts that I found for this talk that we thought were kind of cool looking back on this is that we had events in the past relating to communication and innovation with communication. Back in the 15th century, we have an event in 1406 where we had the very first time in which Byzantine scribes got their hands onto some maps that came from the Greeks. In this case, we get the maps that were associated with the known world of the Mediterranean at the time. And the Byzantine scribes, that was the first time they were able to copy those into multiple other copies, and then were made available at universities throughout Christendom and in the Islamic world. So it was a pretty big year for that because, as we all know, that was in the 15th century where a majority of the age of exploration or exploitation began. So we get the first map makers that were giving merchants more boldness of pursuing further east and west to the Indies and to places they thought would lead to more riches. So that's one aspect.
Sorry, my whole background just disappeared.
That's all right. It's moving on. It's
nothing embarrassing about books.
No, that's okay.
So map making, sorry, age of exploitation. I'm with you. I'll reroute the train.
Right. So in the 1406, we see the Arabic translations. So they were, I need to correct myself, but these were around in the Islamic world, but they weren't made as use of as extensively as they were in the following century with Genoese and Spanish explorers and traders and Portuguese explorers that eventually accidentally found North America. So that's what happens in 1406. Now we fast forward to the next conjunction in Aquarius of that year, 1464. And people are wondering, well, how is it that there was these two events and they had them so close to each other, and why wasn't it like, if it's going around in a circle, why is it not going into a different sign? The reason is because um, anybody who's astronomy or an astrology student knows that we don't have perfect circular orbits in our solar system.
Right.
We have wobbly orbits. And then that aside, that there's no perfectly circular orbits, we also have to remember that people are looking at this through the lens of that Ptolemaic model that we are talking about beforehand. So that tiny little narrow band on Earth that people are viewing like a tiny little camera obscura at these events. And Earth moves too. Earth bobs and weaves in its own place, which makes it seem like these things are moving around or staying in the same place when you'd think that they'd be moving in a succession. And spoiler, it does move. It just moves very, very, very strangely. So 1464 is the next time we get that. So Saturn, Jupiter conjunct in Aquarius, we get a restoration in scholasticism in Europe. That's when we have the great universities being founded for the first time in Italy, Germany, France. It was the beginning of what was considered kind of like the age of scholasticism. A lot of historians don't see the Dark Ages really going on past that point, just because of how much scholasticism we had, and that was partly in thanks to the fact that we had the Gutenberg press just 20 years earlier, starting to make works that were very hard to find, that you had to go to abbeys and places of special religious institutions to look at and to become educated in. So the Gutenberg press is around by that point by about 10 years, but in 1464, we get the first time in Italy in which we get some of the greatest Hermetic and philosophical texts that were being translated in that year in Italy. So we get like Plato's Republic, we get some of Aristotle's discourses translated and then printed on the Gutenberg press for the first time ever. So many of the Roman and Greek philosophies by Roman and Greek philosophers in their original context are now finally available for people to reconsider, opposed to just being regurgitated from the church.
Yeah, that's really interesting. These things, they existed, the knowledge was there, but effectively until you can translate and distribute the knowledge, it kind of sits around and only gets into some hands for a while.
Exactly. If you wanted me to pin the analogs here, I'd say like Jupiter is the Gutenberg press itself, Saturn is the Gutenberg press itself, and Jupiter is the ideas which it wants to bring to the masses.
Whoa. Mind blown. You're just a wealth of information.
I promise you there will be things I don't know.
Ain't that the truth for all of us?
Absolutely.
So we went ahead and took a quick break, but we are back to ask just a couple more questions. Doc, can you tell us a little bit more about, we were chatting about this conjunction and the kind of the conjunctions and events of this year, and some of the things that it's kind of stirred up for you in this archetypal versus horary thinking.
Yeah. Um,
It's a deep question.
it is a deep question, and I think I think the archetypal astrologer is constantly struggling between the two questions of, is astrology about fate, or is astrology about self and self improvement? Because classical astrology, like we don't pretend that classical astrology and Hellenistic astrology doesn't exist. It is the fundamental system that all astrologers in the West use. So we don't just dismiss it just because it's ancient. We say there's things about this ancient system that are still alive in the subconscious. But relating to the myths of that, it's like if we said that all of the astrology itself was fate, then we would say there's no way that we could overcome those challenges. And when we look this year at this conjunction, at this 2020 conjunction, we would say, um, does this grand expansion of systems in an air sign, which is kind of one way to describe what's about to happen, is this great technological confluence or ideas being released out there, like a new internet system, or who knows, like some new binaural system, for example, maybe that comes out. um, does this bode well for us as people? Will this bode well for us? And these are like literal questions about what will come out. The archetypal astrologer wouldn't necessarily ask that, but might, insofar as people who are motivated to do these things subconsciously through those planetary influences may make those technologies happen. Um, we would be saying something like, okay, so for the challenges associated with astrology this year, for these concerns, like what is limiting in us? What is Saturn in us limiting that Jupiter in us can help release? And if those are in an air sign, and in this case, coming up will be in the ninth house, which is about innovation and technology. Like what things in our life do we think will help us? Should we see a new doctor? Should we finally look into that prescription for getting help with maybe a mental illness or a mental concern or a physical concern, or getting off of medication, something that involves trying something new or trying something different, but the point of it being that we're using it with the aid of something, some new technology we haven't tried yet. So that, a little roundabout, but best way I could describe that probably.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's tying it back to what you were saying before about, Gutenberg and the years of exploitation and the maps and stuff. I think we've also talked about this separately, but just thinking about, uh, if this is the kind of thing that's going to happen, what can we be super aware of going forward so we don't wind up, exploiting tons of people or doing really bad things.
Exactly. Considering those energies were there, one of the ones we didn't get a chance to mention was also the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction that happened in 1961, which uh, last time we mentioned was the time in which the Bay of Pigs occurred, and it was probably the most tense period in American history to date. And there's still people in living memory who remember that we were, um, as famously was stated by Mike Wallace, that we are 10 seconds to midnight, and that was um, that was about the fact that we were so close to a potential nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union due to Cuba that we were so concerned about that has a very strong impact in the psyche. We are using our technology that we developed with the nuclear bomb and warfare to um, face off against the Soviet Union when those tensions are there. And the idea is there. You get the Jupiter instinct in there. The idea that we could potentially be in a conflict, but it doesn't materialize. Thank goodness it never materialized. So you have that kind of energy that accompanies conjunction periods as well. So innovation at the same time that we are in conflict.
Yeah. And the idea that, innovation is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's really about what arises out of it when it is unchecked, perhaps.
Correct. These things, I mean, technology is not the same as gnosis or knowledge, or it's not the same kind of knowledge. We rely on two different forms of thinking, and those Greek those Greek nouns themselves just having a completely different fundamental aspect. So we have to find ways to bring ethics to technology.
Right. Yeah. Ooh, there's a lot to think about there. And specifically with the whatever kind of technological innovation is coming out of here and now, specifically we have this pandemic that has brought us, like, I would be doing this interview in person if I could. But then, and for all intents and purposes, there are a lot of really great things that have come out of connecting virtually. But then what are the other side effects that we haven't thought of yet?
Yeah, I mean that's something. There's always that gray area. I think if any astrologers out there tell you that they know for certain what's going to happen, I would question their sanity. We we have broad ideas and themes based off of historical events. It's why we still call astrology a science, even though other scientists might not call us scientists. It's it's the idea that we use as much information as we can and make hypotheses based off inference. That still happens in astrology, even though some might question our methods of how we do it. It's mostly the methodology that gets questioned. But in regards to what's still out there, um, yeah, I mean, the clues are still there. We didn't really talk too much about the house that it's occurring in, being in the ninth house. That's going to be coming up here. So, I mean, houses again refer back to houses are a completely Western made up thing that we do. There's nothing astronomically about houses. Just so people understand before we continue, that is a completely Western astrology thing, and that we use it in astrology to give an idea as to what stage of events are happening for what energies at one time. I've often heard it described as the houses are the props and the stage on the theater for where the actors, who are the planets, are doing whatever scene they're performing, while the signs are like the audiovisual effects that are happening that are aiding to the mood of the particular moment. So
Okay.
they're
I
coloring.
appreciate you putting that in a theatrical perspective for a theater person.
Exactly. That's the best way. I can't. One of my mentors in the past used that term at the Rocky Mountain, so I don't remember who exactly said that, but I've always found that to be an extremely helpful way to sparse house, planet, sign, and what they're doing.
Perfect. We've got mood and then we've got mise en scène.
Exactly. Uh, but yeah, I turn this back on my clients, and in this case, also your listeners. It's if you know about your natal chart, you know about what's going on in your chart this year. Just look to see where the conjunction is happening. Um, again, that ninth house. What's going on in your life at that same time. What are you concerned about as that is going on? And a lot of times, astrology is already giving you the answers. You just have to do the legwork of finding what that could be giving you signs of, even in a sense of like just dreams and ideas.
Yeah. Well, before we move on to our next question, is there anything else that you'd like to impart about different interpretations of this conjunction here and what we might think of going forward?
Yeah, so I'm kind of my hobby horse about this is about the grand conjunction, about um typically about the fact that we're about to go into Aquarius, which again is an air triplicity. Um, we are looking specifically at the fact that this is the first sign that we get an air triplicity in over 600 800 years at this point, not 600, 800 years. That's a long time. Why do the elements matter? Um, because when we deal with elements of triplicities, we're talking about the philosophical elements that are behind them. So, air, philosophical air. If you hear an astrologer talk about that, they just mean to say the things which air rules in us, in our psyche, in our minds, that are associated with those things. So it could be talking, it could be communication, it could be intellect, it could be things that give us intellect. This is why that whole age of Aquarius thing was so important back to astrologers in the 60s, was because Aquarius was so important to them, because Aquarius being an air sign, like we've already talked about, an innovator, the sign of innovation, would bring us out of the previous age, the age of Pisces, and before that, the age of Aries, into sorry, the age of Pisces into Aries. Excuse me. Can't get my ages straight. It's only 26,000 years,
You
right?
know, they go backwards, so it's it's difficult.
Right. But they were concerned about that, and the fact that Aquarius is right there this year, doing that, it. Some astrologers have felt that it could be one of the signs that we are entering that age of Aquarius finally, a little bit, a teensy little bit. But again, it's not. There's no consensus about that because,
We'll do a whole episode about that in the spring.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's related for right now. Just for a nutshell version for viewers and listeners to know, it's thought to be potentially a sign that that is starting to actually finally happen a little bit. Is the fact that this Aquarius is associated with Saturn and Jupiter this year. So, yeah,
Wow.
innovation. Here's hoping for its relationship to a vaccine if we're going to, literalize it into something that's of literal innovation.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially regarding air and or water. Cough, cough. Uh,
Exactly.
all right. So I want to ask you another question here as we're wrapping up.
Hmm.
And that question is, are there any myths or conspiracies associated with either this conjunction or just your field in general that you'd like to dispel before you leave our show today?
Sure. So, grand conjunctions are, if anybody has perhaps theology in their background or anything relating to uh, Christian history or Western history, may know that conjunctions, we, as we alluded to earlier in the episode about the one that was around the alleged birth of Christ, is a big deal when people start thinking of messianic or prophet or wise man births or wise woman births and things like that. Um, as far as I know, I can't find any evidence, as I did research for this, that um, there were particularly notable people born at the times of conjunctions in centuries past. That's not to say that they weren't notable, but compared to other people born at not conjunction times, I've not found a strict correlation. So I want to kind of, you know, move people away from thinking that it's a clear sign that it's a Messiah thing that's going to happen. That's been going on now for hundreds of years, and you can still find plenty of web pages and Twitter accounts that are still quite up on this thing. Um, it should be important to note that egregore of conjunctions being associated with religious strife and new epochs and events is really kind of toxic in the West, because we have a lot of writings around the 17th century from English Protestants about the idea that the conjunction of that year in the 17th century in 1664 would bring about the fall of the Antichrist, in their minds, the Pope. So it's kind of a bit of anti. It was a bit of like it was a bit of intra-Nicene propaganda that was used even then, and I'm worried that people might take that as a sign that something might happen in that the whole conspiracy realm that's here today of, oh, it's going to be the conjunction, we need to figure out who we're watching for, or what's going to happen on the stage of world events in relationship to that. And it's like, I want to help people get away from that and more thinking of like, what does this event mean for us internally?
Right. Yeah. Less Y2K 2012 Antichrist stuff. More, what do I need to do?
Why literalize a mythology when it can live inside you as something valuable for your path?
Oh, that's beautiful. I like that. That's fantastic. That's a great thing to kind of dispel us with there. Um, I have another kind of question for you before we completely wrap up. And this has to do with the fact that our conjunction is not just like happening on any day of the week, any day of the year. It's happening on the winter solstice, which makes it kind of difficult for those of us in the northern hemisphere to see as compared to people in the equator, just because of our angle to the earth that they will be setting in. But I'm kind of wondering, just if you have any ways that you see this fitting in with the solstice, or if you celebrate the solstice, or just what you do for that.
Well, it's kind of funny. So as I'll reveal to your listeners that I'm a I follow a druidic path. So that means I follow kind of a Celtic neo-pagan centered faith that I try to make sure aligns with my scientific training in like horticulture and biology. But I um I see those two things working together in tandem. But the
Totally.
solstice, the solstice is kind of cool because I mean you have astronomically, as you may know, is one of our two eclipse seasons of the year.
Indeed.
So this is not lost to astrologers either. It's one of those other things that we look for. Um, we get our either annular or solar eclipse, our penumbral eclipses right around this time of year, just like we did back in June at the summer solstice. Um,
That was wild.
right, and these are big deals. And people, I've often get asked by people who don't have any idea of paganism. It's like, well, why do the solstices matter so much? And then I show them a Neil deGrasse Tyson video about about our about Earth's elliptical and our eclipses. So it's like now imagine you're living in the second century CE, and what were those people thinking when they saw these strange annular, penumbral, and full lunar eclipses happen? Um, like what do you think they were thinking about? And that's the right. That's the kind of thinking that we try to return to. Again, back to the idea of solving the dilemma of Max Weber 100 years ago of disenchantment. We solve disenchantment by finding what our ancestors found to enchant their lives. And in this case, you have the solstice, which again, solstice is about that meeting point of the year where the light starts to return to Earth. Um, we we get finally the Earth's orbit finally begins to turn back ever so slightly to start making the days ever just slightly a little bit longer each day. It's the return of light. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a literal observation, and our ancestors knew it, and our ancestors celebrated that fact. And um, I talk to a lot of rationalist atheist friends, and I say, well, what would make sense to celebrate? And it's like, well, there's observations that we can make based off of astronomy that can help us determine what's really special to celebrate. So
Yeah, it's a mark that the light is in fact returning, even though the coldest season is now upon us. It won't
right,
be here forever.
and this was a winning argument. I only tell people the story because it was a winning argument of having a group of atheist friends come to a solstice event that we had because this by putting it in those terms of it being a literal event that you can actually measure and celebrate, opposed to something that was a passed down myth by somebody else at some other point to celebrate this day that may or may not be associated with this person.
Right. In a different calendar, no less.
Exactly. So that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question about the solstices are important for that reason. Our ancestors knew, we and our ancestors know that the light starts returning after that day, and occasionally a spooky eclipse that is visible from the geographical location from whom are waiting and watching for it will see one. Doesn't always mean that. I took a look
this year where the lunar and solar eclipses will be visible. Sad face. Of course, we don't have, not in our hemisphere. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. We get a penumbral lunar, but we don't get a full lunar until next year.
Right. And that's, yeah, unfortunately. But the cool thing is that most of the people listening to this now or watching this now will remember the great American eclipse of 2017 when we had our a summer eclipse. And I have people ask me, well, does that count? It's like, well, absolutely it counted, because that's happening somewhere on Earth every year.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Whether or not it's visible to people is another matter.
Right. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, like I've definitely considered eclipse chasing as like an alternate life path.
Would you go all the way to Tierra del Fuego for last year's solar eclipse?
No, I don't have the money. But I did get to do a bunch of really great outreach work during the 2017 event, and that was actually my first full solar like solstice that I've seen. And man, I just want to do that for the rest of my life. But knowing that they happen as often as they do, every time that they're coming up, I'm like, all right, will I buy a plane ticket this time? No, not this time.
I always thought it would be cool to like do kind of like a podcast that was just on eclipse paths of like describing, each upcoming one, because you have two each year that you could potentially use.
Yeah.
And give that as like a
There's a great book I'd like to plug from underneath the shelf here. This book, American Eclipse, and it talks about just like the history of eclipses specifically in this country, and throughout like the Industrial Revolution and whatnot. It's pretty good stuff.
See, if you remember, I've read that book too. I read that just before we had our great American Eclipse. And just for viewers and listeners, I mean, the eggshell version, or I'll go ahead and just say eggshell. So the eggshell version of that book is basically the eclipses have a complex history. They're not always great events. They're not always things that people are anticipating with joy and wonder.
Right.
They can sometimes cause people to do some pretty crazy, awful things. And I won't ruin too much that happens in that book because it's pretty cool history and I want to direct people to read it. But suffice it to say, people get a little freaked out when eclipses happen, because if you're a farmer, you might not be fully aware in the 18th century, 19th century, that there's going to be this total lunar eclipse. And for that, anybody who was in the path of the maximum occlusion path back in 17 remembers it's like 6 minutes of eerie silence where the birds stop making noise. Like the world, like everything stops for 6 minutes.
Yeah.
And everything goes that eerie blue purple all over. And you can just imagine how that would be understood by somebody who didn't know that a solar eclipse was going on.
Yeah. It is. I don't want to talk too much more about eclipses because I do have one of those episodes planned as well. Got everything laid out for the year ahead. Right. But what was I going to say? Who knows? We're wrapping up eclipses.
Right. We were summarizing winter solstice.
Yes.
And the fact that the solstice is about more return into more light, and the fact that we have a lunar eclipse. That's it. That's the nutshell.
Yeah, and not always on the solstice, but that our solar seasons are aligned in really strange ways. Exactly. That is a really fascinating point, and something that I think a lot of people might be familiar with eclipse season, and they might be familiar with the solstices, but they also might not have put those two things together. Kind of like perihelion and aphelion are totally irrelevant to the whole situation, but they're also at really interesting points in time, January and July. So
yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
We're starting to run out of Zoom time here, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you, since speaking of recommending other, books and other topics to explore, if you can tell people who are watching and or listening, where they can find out more information about you or about any of your stuff, and anything else that you would like to plug here.
I still do a lot of private readings, so I don't really have that much of I'm still kind of a private guy, so I don't have yet that much of an internet presence for prognostications yet, but if people are interested in booking me for tarot or astrology reading, they can tweet me on the tweet machine at Crewman Oddwell. That's CREWMANODDWELL. And I take requests for private consultation. And I have a Square store, so that's squareup.com/store/Henosis. That's Henosis on Square Store. And that's about it for me. They can always find me on Twitter and ask me questions if they have any specific inquiries.
That's so gracious. That's perfect. I'll put that in our show notes there, and hopefully people will be able to link to that directly from the YouTube
Absolutely.
machine, as it were. Oh, well, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really enlightening and, mind-opening conversation, also a celebration. And I've actually, in the time that we've been talking back and forth, I've learned so many things and had such a great time. And you are definitely welcome to come back.
Well, thank you, Natalie. It was a pleasure doing this and helping enlighten everybody, and hopefully my wisdom reaches somebody. So I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening and watching Cosmologies. See you in the next one.
From the mysteries within us to the majesty without, cosmology.